Good morning. We're in Ayin Beis, volume 3, page 1222. Aleph Reish Chav Beis. If you want to follow along the text, you don't have it, go to ayinbeis.com, and the PDFs of these pages are all there. Okay. The immediate theme that we are in the middle of is in Avodah, the general 3 stages of growth: Nihi, Chagas, Chabad, in emotions itself, of how we grow in our relationship with God, beginning with Nihi, the behavioral, and that itself we learn 2 levels. That on page 1221, when he began about Avodah Bechinis Nihi, who heskem, is the heskem, is the determination, the commitment to do what is expected, to avoid the negative, embrace the positive, without belishum ispilus ava v'yira, without any stimulation of emotions. So it's essentially totally behavioral. In that itself, he spoke a higher level based on chapter 16 in Tanya. We said a higher level, Madregel Yena Yeser, which is also Nihi, with a Lev Mavin, Beruach Chachma Bina Shebemeche, that the heart understands and appreciates, as does the mind, that it's worthy. That's Masim, Yosa, as the Alter Rebbe says there in Tanya. It's fitting that recognizing that God is beyond and everything is nullified in the presence of God. And therefore it's fitting that we should be completely dedicated. But this is still an intellectual and an emotional awareness and appreciation, but not one where there's an actual emotional reaction. It's not like you feel it in your guts. It's you understand it, and your heart also has a sense of it, but it's still removed from you, as he said. So Nigmer Betfunis, so he comes to a conclusion that commitment is there, and his mind and heart are working, but they're not necessarily, there's no feeling for it. As he says, that he says, the top of page 1222, the word, in general, this is generally an acknowledgement, and a determination. But he still makes it very clear. It does not have the energy and the vitality in a form of something that is emotionally stimulant. It would be like someone saying they're going on a date, just to use an example, and everything checks out on paper. The person you're dating, whether it's the woman or the man, is a good person, someone kind, someone worthy of loving, would be a good mother or a good father and a good husband or wife. All that's there. But do you actually feel the attraction to the person? Do you actually feel that you're going to marry this person? No. It could lead to that. That would be the next stage. But at this point, it's more than just behavioral, meaning you're just doing it because you made the determination to do it. But because it already has your mind and heart is actively involved in the process, but you don't have yet that real emotional awakening, like he describes here. And he calls that, all this is Nihi. Okay. The next level is Chagas. After I review this, I'll go back and put it in the larger context of Ayin Beis, but let's just first sum this up. The next is Chagas. This he calls Hispilus Hamidus. Every word is precise. I'm quoting exactly. Hispilus Hamidus. Shemispol ba'ava b'yir. Now there's beferish Hispilus Hamidus. There's an emotional connection, whether it's through attraction or through awe and yira, but there's an emotion of alive now. And that's called ruach. However, it's Midas Tivim. This means it's like a natural, it's part of our natural wiring that has now become awakened. It's not something necessarily an additional element beyond our natural emotions. In other words, it's the natural love that a person may have, or awe that a person has now become awakened. In the example I gave, that dating process is no longer on paper. My mind and heart says this is a good person, but now you feel it's good for me. But what's really been awakened? Nothing really new. It's your natural love that you have, that a man may have to a woman or a woman to a man, and that has now become activated. So when he says it's Samet Sada Seichel, he qualifies what that means. That even though this is spells behechach, that it comes also through some Seichel is bonanus, because especially now when we're talking about an excitement, a divine emotion, cannot be without any Seichel at all, because the Nefesh Elikis comes from Tikkun, and in Tikkun everything goes Chabad, Chagas. It's not just, in other words, the example I gave about dating does not fit here. Because there you could say, you know what, a person could just have an emotional reaction, and that's it. It doesn't have to be al pi seichel. There are people who fall in love and marry even, and get committed to someone and have emotional, and it's not necessarily based on seichel. It could actually be with the wrong person. But we're talking about in the nefesh halikis, like he's talking here, there always needs some measure of seichel. But he qualifies now, the seichel is not the driving force. The seichel is just the catalyst to awaken the natural emotion that's there already. That's the key thing here. So that's how he qualifies. He says, V'ze'in Adam. Adam is Midas, nevertheless is Milas Seichel. Achayin, hu shahari avayir yeshnam b'teva b'nefesh halikis. The Ava V'yira, the Nefesh Elikis, has embedded in its wiring, in its DNA, a love and awe for God. However, it can remain concealed. Ubchinas Ruach, this second stage, is that Shamidas aimed in Bizgalus, Shebenokel, who Shiur Bizgalus, that this second stage is through some form of contemplation. It easily awakened these natural midas because they're there. They're close to the surface, but they need something to let them. It's like somebody could not, you can be ignoring something and looking the other way, and someone points out to you, hey, look there. You say, oh, that's something I love. So in other words, it's not requires any real chidush. It's essentially a catalyst just to get it awakened. An existing emotional part of the person. In this case, the nefesh halikis. And he gives the example of a child to a father, that there's a natural love from a child to a parent that may not be, it's not always revealed, but it's easy. Love ibizgalas, as soon as he thinks about it, he knows this is my father. Miyad love. As soon as he thinks about, oh, my father, so that natural love comes to the surface, and he yearns and longs for his father. And the same as every moment that he thinks about it, it wakens and reveals. So it's a love that's there, that doesn't need a lot of effort. It needs something to get it going. That's what he means, al pi seichel here. So that's why I didn't call it al pi seichel, because it's not driven by the mind. The mind is just simply an awareness thing. It's just opening your eyes. It's like helping you see. The mind is just making you bringing it to your attention, if you wish. And the same thing is with Avinu Shebashamayim, that ma'at hisbananus leide eich ki hu Avinu amiti, with a little hisbananus, a little thinking about it, recognize that he's our true Father, God, and also the kindness that he does with us. He took us out of Mitzrayim. Memela Meseira Avativis. It automatically, therefore, awakens this natural love. And the same thing with Yira or Shalo Yisrachik Melakus. Also, the concern that he shouldn't get distant from God, which is Yira, and should not do something which is bad in God's eyes. All this is inyan tivi b'nefesh halikisu b'ma'at izbanus hazem is eder umizgala. Meseirum is Gala. So it's all there with a little Lizbananus, brings it to your attention, and therefore it awakens the natural emotion within you. So it has V'chayis, in contrast to Nihi, which doesn't have that energy and vitality. There it's purely behavioral, or behavioral with a mind and a heart that are aware and appreciate. But now there's V'chayis, V'chayis shel Midos. But it's still a chayis of Midos. It's primarily the wired emotions within you. And it doesn't really have the intensity that comes with moichin, with the mind and all the firepower of the mind, which we'll learn about in a moment. The next third level. Okay, so those are the two levels. A thing that can be asked is this. If you look in chapter 16 in Tanya, he speaks also about two levels. And the lower level is the one that he quoted here, that a person's mind and heart appreciate it. But if you go in Tanya, look earlier, the beginning of chapter 16, he speaks where it seems like there's more of the emotions involved and more of the mind involved. Not just that you say it's appropriate. The question is that first level in Perek Tazayin similar to the second level here in Chagas? I think not, but it's just interesting to explore when you look in chapter 16 in Tanya, because he speaks clearly a level that's lower and a level higher there as well. Now, I will also refer you, I mentioned last time that this was discussed earlier in Ayin Beis. So I'm going to give you the places, and I, of course, taught it and went through detail there. So I have two places that I want to refer you to. One is chapters 255 through 257 in volume 1. That's pages 516 and on. And in volume 2, chapter 394 and on, which is pages 812 and on. So there, he also talks about the three levels he discusses here. And looking there, you'll see things that can add to what we're discussing here. In how these levels of growth, of how we grow, which we'll soon talk about, the growth part of it. Okay, so that is what we summed up, what we learned in the last few days. Now the context, just briefly, the context to Ayin Beis in general, this is all coming to explain Gan Eden, the difference between Gan Eden before Avodah and after Avodah. So we know Gan Eden is a special place that's higher than the regular world or worlds. It's a place of tainug, pleasure. The divine pleasure manifests there. Bina of Bria, which receives from Keser Chachma of Bria, which receives from Keser Chachma Bina of Malchus, all the way to Keser of Atzilus, and all the way to the highest levels that we learn from Malchus of Ein Sof. So Gan Eden manifests that, even without Avodah. That's the way God created. He created a garden, a place where there's a special divine revelation called Tainug, Keser Malchus, as we learned, which in turn drives the rest of Ishtalshlus, God's pleasure from existence. So first it's a pleasure that's Isnasa Satzmi, that's beyond existence. Then it turns into a desire, a ratzon, which turns into a shape and design of existence, Chachma Bina, through Midos, all the way to Malchus. So Gan Eden, in contrast to the other worlds, has a sense and experience of muhus, of the personality of this divine source, especially its pleasure. Whereas the rest of the world only knows Yedias HaMetzias, the existence of it. But then the Avodah, when we come to this world and fulfill the kavanah, the purpose of which God created existence, through Torah and Avodah, Gan Eden then is filled with a whole new dimension of light and energy. That's even more than the original. So what that energy is, that is the explanation that he's starting to explain. That's what we're beginning now at the bottom of 1220. He said, to understand that, let's go back to understanding the inner and outer dimension of Malchus, also has the inner and outer dimension of Zoh, Midos. So now we're discussing different levels of relationship with God, And after 30 pages of discussing this, he's going to go back to Gan Eden. Because Gan Eden basically is a manifestation of this relationship. We have either a relationship with Tainug on its own, or a deeper relationship that comes through Avodah. So to understand that, we have to understand what the Avodah is. So he's explaining now what is the human work that we do as we grow in our relationship with God, from the behavioral to the emotional, to ultimately the intellectual, the Chabad. That in turn will teach us how Gan Eden is enriched through our Avodah. And we'll understand the difference between Gan Eden before Avodah and after Avodah. Now, Gan Eden itself is also an introduction that began on page 1211 to explain Havaya Yechatu Merivov, how God shatters his enemies. God's enemies are shattered, which came after discussing Ayin, which is that the very darkness and concealment of existence will also become revealed as a divine force. That was the beginning of volume 3, which is a continuation of Yadaita Yem v'Shavesa Levavecha Ki Hashvayu Elikim Shamayim Mimal V'La'aretz Mitochas Ein Eid. Was talking earlier about Havayu Elikim, the unification of the divine within existence, unification with the divine beyond existence, transcendence, Havayu de La'ela. But it's all still Gilui, revelation, and all in the form of Yadaita Hayem, as we learn Tzimtzum and Gilui and all that. But now the Ein comes to introduce that the very Elikim, the night itself, Laila Kayem Yer, the night itself will be transformed. And all that is part of the larger story of Ayin Beis, as in context of that even post-Tzimtzum reality and post-Parsa reality, after Atzilus, should experience a pre-Tzimtzum consciousness, which is the ultimate story of Ayin Beis, the interface between the highest levels of the divine and the lowest levels of existence. And it's all part of a long parenthesis, the two halves of an image connecting the divine and existence, but also the existence as it is after the Tzimtzum, after concealment. But not just that the concealment leads to light, but now we're learning that the concealment itself will be transformed to reveal its very divine force that makes it a concealment, which is even higher level. And all that, to explain that, he went to Havaya Yechat Meriva, from that to Gan Eden, but before Avodah and after Avodah, and now we're explaining that through the Avodah of a person, because obviously if we want to transform existence, we need to start from the bottom of how we work and we function. We begin as human beings, which are the divine is concealed. And our first step is behavioral change, where we become aware of God, even on a behavioral level, and then climb from Nihi to the higher level of Nihi, to Chagas, to Chabad, and higher, as we're going to learn. So that's the context of Ayin Beis. And now we're up to Chabad. Now, unless someone wants to ask anything, I'm happy to take any question. Now, we're going to learn now on page 1222.
The ability to achieve in a post-Tzimtzum reality, a pre-Tzimtzum consciousness. Can we achieve that to a certain extent by accessing Gan Eden, which is in the lower level, which is Bina, it's after Tzimtzum, but it has Kesser in there, and the pleasure, Oneg, of Atik. So is that something accessible in our lifetime? Can we access Gan Eden right now in our day-to-day life? And B, if by accessing that, are we in a certain sense able to access the pre-Tzimtzum consciousness because of Atik and Oneg that's in Gan Eden?
Well, we're going to learn this more in detail later, but yes, you can access it through Avodah. That's how you access it. You can't just access it like that. It's not the door you can open. You open it through your Avodah. The Avodah we're talking about that's going to increase energy in Gan Eden is also how you access Gan Eden. Gan Eden is not just there for the taking. There's a level of Gan Eden as it was a God-created existence a certain way. Now we come in, the Neshama comes down below. It's through our Avodah that we are going to access, and more than access, we're going to actually create Gan Eden that's much greater. That's number one. Number two, the Gan Eden on its own without Avodah is not going to access pre-Tzimtzum, because without Avodah, it's still a lower level. That's what we're going to learn. To really access Prit Tzimtzum, you're going to have to go down to this world where things are concealed and transformed from the bottom up. Gan Eden has a limited version of it. The key is going to be Avodah always. So nothing can replace Avodah. Now, do people have from time to time grace, where a person, God gives them a gift of a certain reward? Yeah, that happens, but that's not permanent and it's not sustainable. The goal here is transformational. And transformation can only come from us really, the only way to get pre-tzimtzum is to transform the tzimtzum. And that cannot be done by, in other words, even if you were able to sneak into Gan Eden right now and get some type of way in, it wouldn't get to the pre-tzimtzum. Gan Eden is in Bria. It's not pre-tzimtzum. So to get the pre-tzimtzum is only one way. You have to transform the tzimtzum, or else the tzimtzum will block your way in.
Great.
Go
ahead. So what we normally conceive of,
usually as Eliezer, you're trying to find a shortcut, right?
no, but we normally think that after our life, after 120 years, we enter Gan Eden. But the Rebbe is telling us that we can access it right now, today, in Chabad Thomas, right? In our day-to-day life, we can have.
Where do you see he says that? I didn't. Which line are you reading? Where does he say you can access it right now?
I thought that's all. We're getting to that through our Avodah. We can access Gan Eden.
Through our Avodah, we actually create a far higher level than Gan Eden. It's even more than access. Yes, correct. So
we can experience Gan Eden through our Avodah.
He's not talking about experiencing Gan Eden now. He's talking about how Gan Eden becomes greater than the original Gan Eden through our Avodah. That's the specific theme here.
Okay. And are we then able, by this Tosefis, this additional co-op?
You're asking if somebody, for example, God forbid, passed away this week, and they went to Gan Eden that they had built, in addition to the original Gan Eden, they also had built it through their Torah and Avodah. Do they get some additional energy? Yes, they do. They're benefiting from the divine presence in Gan Eden. They're learning Torah and enjoying divine pleasure. That's correct. That's what you're asking?
No, what I'm asking is that this elevated state of Gan Eden, is that, can we experience that without having to die? Can we experience that in that dimension in our lives?
Not in a very revealed way. No, not really in a very revealed way until Mashiach comes, when then it will all be revealed.
Okay.
Like he said. So right now, yeah, a taste here and there. You can have some taste of it. It's part of the whole discussion, Ayin Beis. If you go back, I don't know if you were here in these classes, but I'm back on pages 1211, 1212. He asked all these questions about, is there schar in this world? Or is it, so in one place it says, schar b'hai el maleka. We don't get schar in this world. The schar is only in Gan Eden. So this is part of the questions and discussions on page 1212, which we're in the middle of, where he directly asked this question: do we get any of that schar today? Because it seems like there's a contradiction. Some places it says we do, and some places it says we don't. So that's all going to be part of the whole big picture here.
Thank you.
Go 1212. He talks about that very explicitly. Yeah. Generally speaking, if you've heard the expression "kimunach bekufsa," that all the work we do now generates energy. Every good deed, right now, learning Ayin Beis is generating energy. So we don't see it with our physical eyes, but it's being stored for us, like inside of a treasure chest. The Rebbe often refers that, and we were even given the key. All we have to do is open the chest, and that's the geula. So all the mitzvahs, all the divine energy generated through the generations changed this world. We spoke about it. We see changes in this world, but most of it still remains concealed from most of us. So it's like stored. Where is it stored? In Gan Eden. That's like Kemunach B'Kufsa. So Gan Eden is not somewhere in the sky. Gan Eden is a deeper level of spirituality that right now stores tremendous amount of energy. And the Rebbe says that the Geula comes then like an eruption, all that energy will come pouring out. It's all there, right by the surface. And there are glimmers of it and a taste of it in many of the Giluyim that have changed the world, whether it's the Giluy of Chassidus, technology, the advancements in science, and the decline of violence and crime and war and all the other stuff are all part of it. But the full Geula is basically Goyla with an Aleph. We'll open the chest, and then that's why it's not a miracle, because it's thousands of years of accumulative energy that's come through our Avodah. Now, when a Shama goes to Gan Eden now, it has part of it. It's not the full Geula. Remember, going to Gan Eden is not to be compared to the Geula, but we're going to discuss. Olam Haba, Tchias HaMesim, is going to be even greater than Gan Eden, obviously. Olam Haba, like he began. Now, this is all, he started his topics on page 12, literally page 1211. If you go, he says, the Hefresh ben Gan Eden Olam Haba on page 1211, asked a bunch of questions, said some things that began the answer, but now the development of the answer, as is the style of Ayin Beis, is going to come after many pages. So right now, I'm just trying, as the so-called MC here, I'm trying to just keep the balance going here. So right now, think of it this way. We're learning now the process of how we refine ourselves as we climb this ladder and get closer and closer. And in our own lives right now, through Chagat, Nihi, Chagas, and Chabad, in connecting the more, because the more we relate to godliness, the more we will have a relationship with all this energy that we're talking about. That's in all of Seder Shtalshlus. So that's what we're talking about. So in other words, just like we talk about accessing Asiya and Yetzirah and Bria and Atzilus, Gan Eden is the bridge between Atzilus and Bia, basically, as we're going to learn and as we have already learned. And we'll discuss that as well. Gan Eden is going to be a bridge between the pre-Parsa and the post-Parsa. Pre-Tzimtzum and post-Tzimtzum. But there's Gan Eden on its own, and there's Gan Eden through Avodah. That's where we're middle of talking about. So that's what we're discussing.
Thank you so much.
Sure. Okay. So with that, with that, I'm on page 1222. We're on page 1222. And he's going to go now, Omnom B'chinas Chabad. The line begins, Ve'em B'zeh Gili Er HaMoichin. That's Chagas. So we've determined, we've already established there's behavioral with some involvement of mind and emotion. There's emotion, but it's still natural emotion. And now comes Chabad. I mean, just to make it a little more palatable or palpable, I always confuse the two, but okay, they both make sense. If you think of educating children, and we're going to learn about that a bit soon, you know, there's behavioral. You teach a child, do not cross the street, period. You teach a child manners, say thank you. Here's how you eat. It's almost completely behavioral, especially at the younger stage. But as a child grows a little older and their mind begins to develop a little more, you also explain to the child why. So because you don't want the child just to follow orders, you want them to internalize. But how many stages of internalizing are there? We know it's endless almost. And different children have different styles. But the goal is that you want them to begin to use their mind and like almost say to your child, listen, you think it's the right thing that you grab that toy away from a friend? And you want the child to say, no, it's not. Now, when they're very young, you just tell them that's not how you behave. But as they get a little older, you're trying to teach them and say, why? Now, can you say they fully emotionally feel it? Not necessarily. In the he itself, in behavioral itself, you can find many levels. He mentions 2, but I could right now figure out another 5 if you wish, if you really start breaking it down. Then comes a point where the child gets to a place where their emotions can actually feel something, not just what you tell them to do. And I'm not talking about just plain impulses. I'm not talking about impulsive emotions. We're talking about emotions that are guided towards something that is godly, that they should feel something. And if you go through the process, you can find literally all these stages. And then, of course, Chabad, which usually is when the mind begins to mature, that's called Bas Mitzvah or Bar Mitzvah, where the Moichin come in, where now a person can be expected to have self-control. They can be expected to restrain themselves. They can be expected to control their emotions and bring a whole power of their mind into the picture, which he's going to speak about now. So I just wanted to give, the more examples you can find within our lives, obviously the easier it is to understand these levels, because as I point out many times, I find that when we start analyzing, it becomes so mechanical and scientific, we lose touch with the reality. Think of an example in your life, or children, or educate, or ever, or training people at work. And you could see, you'll find these stages. The more you can do that, the more questions will be answered. Instead of trying to figure out, does this have this level, that level? You start seeing, 1 second, what are we talking about now? What else do we need to introduce? This goes back to, again, the more you can relate to the Avodah, and I mean Avodah also in serving God, but also Avodah as in some practical applications in our lives, the easier it will be to understand these levels. So with that, he goes now to Chabad. Omnam b'chinas Chabad, however, the level of Chabad after Nehi and Chagas, which is behavioral, as we said, Netzach and Chagas, emotions, is an emotion, an awakened emotion, a stimulated emotion. He says, but Chabad, hu hasoga mamish. It's not just the minimal to make you aware and bring to your attention the natural love you have to your Father, to God. But this is hasoga mamish, actual full comprehension. Leida riboy hishtalshlus elamis alyenim v'tachtenim, to know the multitude or the extensive hishtalshlus, evolution of the worlds, the higher ones and the lower ones, but my losan and madregasan, in their quality and their level, one higher than the other. So till now we didn't talk about this at all. Till now we spoke about either intelligence that tells you that God is reality and everything deserves to be nullified, everything is nullified before him, and therefore everything it deserves to be loved and connected with, and that's why behaviorally you follow. Or the hasaga that we said before, that's rather the hisbananus b'nakel, that just makes you aware of your natural love for God. Now he's talking about a full-blown contemplation and comprehension. So not just there's ishtalshlus, the different levels, higher and lower, their quality, their levels. And how all of them are nullified in comparison, in contrast to God's speech, because God created it all with his speech. So as high as the levels of Atzilus, of Asiyah, Yetzirah, Bria, and Atzilus, and higher, they're all nullified because they're all coming from God's words. And they're considered like Ayin and Ephes, like nothing and nothingness. Ayin and Ephes is complete nothing, and Ayin is relative nothing, as we learned earlier. So that's the Hisbananus we're talking about now. So the mind is fully occupied with all of this contemplation. The chain, and he goes on further, and also, or similarly, Hisbananus be'eze inyan eliki, a contemplation in a particular divine idea. Ba'asaga gemura. This can be thinking about the tzimtzum, or about Oyer, or about Ano Emlech, or about Malchus, whatever it is. Something ba'asaga gemura, in a complete comprehension. Shemevin u'masig es ha'inyan heitiv, that he understands and he comprehends the idea well. All this it leads to what? Va'er ha'seichel meir etzlei begili. And the er ha'seichel, which means the energy of the mind, this mind power, this brain power, is radiating by him in a revealed way. Asher al yedei zeh. Now, through which this mind energy, nimshach ba'av gdela lalakus, it flows and channels into and draws into a great love for godliness, b'rotzen v'cheshek, with a desire and a passion. Sheyesh b'zeh er v'chayis rav migili er hameichin. This now has an intense energy and vitality from this power of the brain or the mind. Okay. So we need to explain what this means, because the obvious question is, okay, this is great brain power. What does that have to do with emotion? Why is it automatically turning into emotion? We learned before from Perek Ayin that you could have all this understanding and you don't have no emotional feeling altogether. You just know, and even your heart senses and feels, appreciates God. But what happened now with Moichin that made it stronger than that, that it's not only natural emotions. You have something very intense going on that is at the highest level, relatively speaking, of a person's love to God. Like he calls it Ratzon v'cheshek. Now, obviously, the Rebbe Rashab is speaking briefly here. And I mentioned before, if you look at chapters 255 and 250 through 257, and chapter 394 and on that I mentioned before, in volume 1 and volume 2, there's more arichas, more discussion there. So I'm going to sum up exactly what he's saying here to make it understand, because right now, we don't, remember, so the first thing you have to keep in mind is that all these three levels are all within Midos. If you remember on page two, last page, 1221, he said, on top, and look at line 3 of 1221. You do it, the B'midas yesh gimel madrei is Chabad chagas nehi. The whole thing began not just to explain there are three levels within Midos themselves. So first he spoke about two levels. If you go back to the top of page 1221, he said, there's Pnimius Zah, Pnimius Midos, which is with Gili HaMoichin B'Zah, Gimel Rishenus of Zah, and Zayin Tachtenus of Zah. I'm reading the second line on page 1221. It doesn't have Gili Moichin. And then he said there's three levels in Midos actually when you break it down. So it's critical to realize he's not just talking about Chabad Chagas Nehi as three sections of the spheres. Chabad is Moichin, Chagas emotions, Nehi is actions or behavioral. But he's talking them all within emotions themselves. So once you know that, so the real discussion here is what is the three levels in emotions of how each level makes the emotion more powerful, if you wish, more vitality, more v'chayis. He keeps using that word. Does it have v'chayis or does not have v'chayis? So let me now explain how Chabad adds to that, to the first two levels. Just want to see one thing before I continue. 1 second. Yeah. So if you look at the end of the paragraph on page 1221, I want to just refer. He said, Chabad, Hushiyesh b'zegili hamechin, u'komesh mashpia chesed mitzad atam, kumay mitzad ha'av u'kai gavna, sheyesh b'zeribi gil er v'chayis. So he says, in other words, it's not just due to the natural love you may have for someone, but it's coming from a deeper but it's coming from a deeper reason, because you understand why you should love that person. He says, as we see, even a person who's naturally a good person, nevertheless, when his mind compels him and tells him that it's important to be mashpia, so then his giving will be with far more vitality and power. So that helps us understand what we're doing here. So when it comes now to take a human being like us, simple person, busy with your own life, more or less in the survival mode, or a level where we're not even talking about doing anything bad, but more or less focused on self-interest. And you wake up in the morning and you say Moida Ani, which is Heidah, and your consciousness is aware that life is not only about you, that you have a responsibility to something greater than you are, that's God. It doesn't, so on a very behavioral level, you make the commitment that to do what's right and to avoid not doing what's wrong. Then you think about it some more. As you become more involved in it, you can develop also, not just purely behavioral, like you said, you also appreciate why you're doing this behavioral. You have good reasons for it. But it's not necessarily, let's put it this way, it's not like you've heard the song and your spirit has become excited about it. Then there's a next level where you get excited about godliness. But it's all a natural excitement, just like you get excited about your child or a child about a parent. It's part of who we are. Now you've brought it to the surface, and you have heard the song. And you're like, not just saying, Moida Ani, I acknowledge, out of rote, mechanically. We're all talking about with good intention, but more behaviorally. You actually feel something. You feel a love. You feel a connection. It could be an appreciation. Like he said, appreciation for what God does for you. So, you suddenly think about it. You say, look, God has given me children, health, parnasa, bona chayim ezena. I appreciate it. And I feel a certain attraction and connection and love. But that doesn't mean yet that you know and appreciate God in his full glory. You're appreciating God as he relates to you and as you relate to him. When you learn Chassidus on the next level, and again, Chabad all within Midos, and now you come to realize, maybe using the example with the artist, you can appreciate the art behaviorally. You then can also appreciate the artist based on what he's done. He's created something for you, a beautiful piece of art that you can hang up on your wall. But you're not talking about the artist here. It's not like you have a relationship with the artist. You have a relationship with what he's done for you. And you love what he's done for you because he's giving you life. He's giving you sustenance. He's giving you many blessings. But then you start learning about him. Let me learn about this God that has done all this, created this world. And you start realizing, one second, there's a whole dimension to him that's beyond your needs. So then the natural love you have for him is going to become far more intense. Remember, we're not beginning with Chabad. We're beginning with emotions. It's all within Midos. The only question is, are the Midos behavioral? Are they emotional? Or they now also have a deep appreciation? Let's talk about spouses. I don't want to speak the first level, but it exists. There are people who are married, and behaviorally, they do everything right. They're civil to each other. They're kind to each other even. But for whatever reason, they may not have strong emotions. It doesn't mean they aren't there. Maybe they've not been revealed or whatever. But there's a behavioral relationship. Then there's an emotional relationship. You actually feel for each other. Feel a connection. But it's not necessarily completely on the terms of the other person. It's about whatever connection that consists of. It could be two people who've lived together for a long time, as the Rabbi says, develop a deep connection. Dependency. I don't mean in a bad way. A certain, part of your life. It's like part of who you are, part of your life. But then there's another level where you begin to learn and appreciate your spouse in things you never thought about before. You start, let's say, discovering a dimension in your spouse that you never even knew about. And that could be somebody tells you something that you never knew. Or I don't want to use the same example like studying your spouse, but the idea is that you're discovering something about your spouse that is on a far deeper level. So whatever ava you had in step 2 will become far greater. You suddenly say, wow, look at this person that I've always loved, and look now what I discovered. So it's not that the awareness of the person's greater qualities suddenly creates a new love, but it turns the whole thing into a whole other dimension. So when it comes to God, you can have that relationship, like you said, an avativis of a child to a parent who's providing for the child. But then you start learning Chassidus properly. I'm not talking about theoretically and abstractly about the Olamis that he says. He keeps saying that you're learning it, but with hasaga hativ, you're understanding it well. And that your mind and your whole being is now consumed with this greatness of God and all the details. He says, so now the love, that natural love that you had, becomes a whole different story. So the Avodah, now there's like, 1 second. I want a relationship with God more than I've ever wanted before. I mean, if any person in marriage has found that type of experience where suddenly, even after 30 years, 40, 50 years of marriage, there's suddenly a surge of love to your spouse due to something. I mean, there's always a surge that can just be emotional. But I'm talking about you suddenly appreciate something or you learn something about your spouse, and there's a whole new surge of love because you not just loving the person naturally, because a man naturally loves a woman and a woman naturally loves a man. In this case, it's the spouses, but there's a whole new appreciation of that individual. So there you have yourself a full-blown, what he calls Av of Ir V'Chayis Rav, and it's coming from Gilui Ir Hamechen. It's not because it's intellectual. That's the key thing to remember. Very often we think of this, this has become cerebral. No, not because it's become cerebral. It's because the mind has taught you about the other things that you were completely not aware of, or more importantly, your whole mind and all its intensity is now, it's not just you're going through behavioral, or you're not just going through natural emotional feelings. The mind brings a whole new level of vitality. So I would say 2 things that the Moichin the Chabad adds. One is that you actually appreciate new levels that you didn't appreciate. And number 2, because the mind is so much more powerful than emotions. When I mean by power, I mean it's Eir. Brain power is stronger than heart power. Emotions are very powerful and very often are more powerful than the mind. But when the mind is at its best, it's bringing the highest level of Gili. Why in Elam HaTikun, Chabad comes before Chagas, even though Chagas has an extremely critical role to play, is because Chabad is closer to Lakus than Chagas is. It's closer to Keser. So Chabad has, therefore, brain power always has more power, literally in Giluyim, than Chagas. I'm not talking about the emotional effect on a person. I'm talking about purely the amount of intensity there. That intensity now invested in the Chagas and the emotions brings a whole new level of vitality and energy. That's how I would explain it. I'm sure there's more to be said. Maybe you guys may have some thoughts as well. But that we're reading it all sounds like he said before, that you can be a person who loves to give tzedakah, let's say. You love to help people. Fine. But then someone tells you, here's a situation where he says that this person really needs tremendous help, more than usual. So what do you think will happen? The goodness that's in you that you would have given a certain amount, I don't mean just amount quantitatively, I mean even qualitatively, takes on a whole new dimension. The love you have will become far, far stronger. When your mind tells you, like he says, Seichel Mechayev, then it'll be far stronger, far more, and far more intense. Because the mind has a power has that persuasive power, if you wish, to enhance anything. It would be just like we talked about training people at work. So they could be behaviorally dedicated to their job. They could also be emotionally dedicated, naturally. But imagine you explain to them that you do the job properly, you're going to save 1 million people. Whatever, you're doing something that's going to eliminate famine. And you understand how you'll work. So much more than just your natural compassion and love, now you understand what this work can do. Of course, everybody would work with so much more passion and so much more commitment and so much more investment and much more love, because you realize the implications. And the mind can introduce that. The heart is wired to do something compassionate or kind to another. The mind can bring a whole new dimension to it because it opens up it expands the horizons of what is being accomplished here. So that's part of how I would explain of what he's saying here. But I'm going to stop now, pause now, and hear your thoughts or questions, if you do have any. I think it's also important, I want to reiterate again. We usually think of mind and emotions not as opposites, but as two different entities. The mind is objective, reflective, can guide you. The heart is emotional and experiences things. The mind is detached and aloof, but the emotions are also impulsive, subjective, could be prejudiced, blinded, etc. It's important that that's not the context he's talking about here. Here he's talking about emotions that are being guided toward godly things. The question is are they behavioral? Are they emotional? Or do they also have the whole mind's power within it? So we're not talking about the mind right now in context of so-called checking the heart or the emotions. Are you really feeling the right thing? And so on. Or the mind, in a way, even taming the heart. That's not what he's talking about here. Here he's talking about the mind being actively involved in the emotional experience with God. So it's like not just loving God, but it's also knowing and loving God. I just wanted to make that clear. It's almost actually, thinking about das and intimacy. So Chachma Bina is knowing something. That's not connected to emotions. Das is intimate. So it's more like das in relationship to emotion. He's not saying das here per se. He's actually using hasaga, which is more bina, but it's definitely connected to that dimension. You'll know das. You personalize and make it intimate, like we learned, and that will carry it into the heart, into the emotions. So this is more like v'ahavtas Hashem Elokecha b'chol levavcha, b'chol nafshecha, b'chol meidecha. All levels in emotional experience with the divine. I think that's important to qualify, because not to be confused where the mind is being used, like in Tanya, for example, the nefesh elokis, nefesh habami. That's not what he's addressing here per se. Okay.
Is he, real quick question, is he saying that the feeling of love that comes about is aroused by the use of Chabad is stimulating the other Midos to let's say Chagas, to create the love, or it's somehow it's a love within Chabad? It's a love. It's let's say Chagas of say Chesed of whatever, of Chachma, or Chesed of Bin, or Chesed of Das. That would be like love within inside Chabad. Or you could say that, like you've been saying along here in the prior levels, that there's a stimulation, hisbonenus, that creates an arousal within the other Midos. Do you understand the question?
I think I understand, but he says clearly on line 3 of page 1221, B'midas yesh gimel madregas Chabad chagas nehi. So we're talking about Chabad chagas nehi in the Midas. He's not talking about Chabad outside of the Midas now. Talking about Chabad within the Midas.
Okay.
And most likely, since he said in the second level that a person has natural emotions and they have to be brought to the surface by even a a light hisbonenus, a light contemplation. So clearly when Chabad follows that, he's talking about the natural now going even further, like he said at the end of the paragraph on 1221, that a person who's naturally inclined and wired to do kindness, when he has a reason with seichel, his kindness, his ashpa, will be beribi v'chayis rav. So clearly he's talking in that progressive order. In other words, in the growth of a person's emotional experience of God. So you could have behavioral, so-called emotions, you can have emotional emotions, and you can have intellectual emotions.
Got it.
Chabad-driven emotions, yeah.
Understood. Thank you. That's exactly what I want to understand. Can you, like in 5 seconds, can you explain with the Gimel Rishonos where you were going up above and explaining how the Midos were divided?
That's on top of page 1221.
Yeah, 1221.
The Gimel Rishonos of Zah is in general the Chabad of Zah. The only thing, he broke it down to 3. The Zayin Tachtenis breaks into 2. Gimel Rishonos of Zah is Chabad and Zah, the Midos. Zayin Tachtenis and Zah, Chitzenius of Zah, is Chagas and Nehi. And now he broke it into 3, Chabad, Chagas, Nehi within Zah. That's essentially that.
Thank you.
Sure. Any other questions? Okay. So we'll continue. Let me continue the next paragraph. So now he's going to continue this process. And I want to reiterate again what I said before. It's very clear the more you read it, that he's talking about right now, not just the ideas that he spoke about, but the actual application of how we internalize godliness in our lives. So this is definitely a section here that's not just talking about the levels, it's talking about how it plays itself out in our lives. And this Nehi, Chagas, and Chabad. Now he's going to go and make that even further, even more powerful. That this is actually a 3-stage process that everybody goes through. He says, Vihine. And now, Gimel Madregas Hanal, the 3 above levels, above mentioned levels, Nehi, Chagas, Chabad. Let's call them behavioral, emotional, and, for lack of a better word, intellectual or cognitive emotions. Yuvan ba'efen elyon yeser will be understood on a higher level or in a higher way, and we'll soon try to understand what is that. Why is it higher? But he says it's definitely ba'efen elyon yeser. He used that expression before when he talked about nihi. The madreg elyon yeser. There he said madreg. Here's efen elyon yeser. So it's like taking it to a higher level. Shein gimel madregas. That these are the 3 levels called Mutvah, Murgash, and Muskal. So let me translate. Mutvah means that something is natural this way, natural. Murgash meant it's felt, and Muskal means it's understood. We'll soon understand what this means. Shekosav Apardis, the Ramak in Pardes, in the Sefer Pardes writes, Shar Ches Perek Chav Daled, in the 8th section, the 8th gate, chapter 24. Shein Chabad Chagas Nehi. The Mutvah, Murgash, and Muskal, backwards, it's from the bottom up, is Chabad is Muskal, Chagas is Murgash, and Nehi is Mutvah. He's going to explain. So we'll see what he's saying now. Mutvah, Pchinas Nehi. Oh, he says it explicitly. I just said it myself. Mutvah is the level of Nehi. Netzach Yesod, the 3 lower, the behavioral that we spoke about. Murgash is Chagas, Chesed, Gvura, Teferes. The emotion, the core emotions, the guf. The first is Regel, Guf. Umuskal, Chabad, the 3 highest. The Gimel Rishonos. V'akol hu ba'amidus. He repeats it again. And everything here is in the emotions themselves. So what's then the difference between the 3? If it's all in emotions. Rak, shezeu hagdolas hamidus. This is the growth and the maturity, the maturing of the emotions. Begimel madreges in the three levels, and he's introducing another three terms. The ibur yenike moichin. Ibur means gestation, pregnancy. Yenike is nursing, and moichin is mind. I'm going to explain. So the words Mutvah, Murgash, Muskal really come from Sifrei Chikira. This is the more philosophical books, like the Sefer Ikrim, even the Mer Nevuchim, maybe, I don't think he mentions it, but Sefer Ikrim for sure. The more philosophical books. Ibur Yenika Moichin is Kabbalistic language. But they essentially mean similar. Ibur is the three. So he's talking now about actually, this is a very, very psychological section now going to be, the actual maturity of emotions from the youngest age to we grow into adults. And the Chakrim call it Mutvah, Murgash, Muskal, meaning first you, like a newborn child, everything is impulsive behavior. A child does not think that it's thirsty or it starts crying, not because it's calculating. It's purely instinctively an impulsive behavior, like reflexive behavior is maybe the right word, reflexive. It's how it's wired. God made that a child is hungry or thirsty or in pain is going to cry. Murgash is already a developed feeling, where a child may come to you and say, I want something, I like something. There's already an active conscious feeling as opposed to reflexive feeling. Maybe that's the best way to put it. It's a conscious emotion. And Muskal is when the mind plays a role in the whole emotional development. So it's not just rampant, impulsive emotions doing whatever they want. I'm not talking reflexive, but even and it's now reached a level of maturity, moichin. In moichin itself, of course, there are many levels. Katnus ha-moichin, gadlus ha-moichin, and so on. Mutvah, Murgash, Muskal is those three levels. Ibur is pregnancy, doesn't mean necessarily pregnancy in the mother's womb. It means that first stage where the child is still essentially completely dependent on that which is around it, doesn't have the ability to have its own independent feelings. Yunika is when the child is the stage of nursing, even though newborn babies nurse, but Yunika already means that the baby is developing some of its own faculties, and the meichin is when the mind comes into play. I think he's going to explain it. If not, I'll explain it more as we go along when it's necessary. But basically, it's similar three levels. So now, the Rebbe Rashab is saying this is finite yeser, what we learned before, three stages of development and maturity of the emotions. So let's learn. We'll learn. We're going to learn it. I'll see how far I can get to, because I see. This is now going to be quite a few pages. I'm just looking. Mutvah, Murgash, Muskal goes all the way. At least 6-7 pages. But it's quite fascinating stuff, because this is actually in many ways much more relatable, because it's talking about our own development, which of course reflect levels in the Shtalshlus also that go stage by stage. She starts with Mutvah. Let's start with Mutvah. The level of Mutvah, hein teva hamidus k'mo shehein be'tildus betulda mebeten. This is the natural emotions, the way they are. Betulda means from birth. Betulda mebeten means from birth, from the womb. In Yiddish, he says, B'loshen Yiddish, natur. In Yiddish, natur means nature. It's the natural wired emotions. Rachmani, that he's a compassionate person, or compassionate emotion. Oyachzari, which means someone cruel, has like a cruel side. Kamtsen, stingy. Oypazron, what's the opposite of stingy? expansive, giving, broad-hearted, what's the opposite? Okay, you get the idea. Rachel levov, weak of heart or soft of heart, or kosha halev.
Pasron is not a giving. Pasron is not giving. Pasron means
I just said
no limits.
That's what I just said. I said expansive giving. I didn't just say giving. I said the opposite of stingy. That's pasron. To spread out. Pasron means to give expansively. Rachel levov, soft of heart, or it could be sometimes weak of heart, or kosha halev, or a tougher heart, stronger heart. Ukahai gavna, etc. and similar. He's giving a few more examples. Shiflus visnasus. Shiflus means a certain lowly sense of self. Visnasus means a certain high, holding yourself in high esteem. It's more exalted state. Chedva or eitzev, a happy personality and disposition, or eitzev, a more depressed or darker disposition. Chedva is also joyous disposition. Eitzev is a more depressed, a more, let's call it despondent disposition.
Sadness.
So he gave here a bunch of examples of purely natural characteristics that a person is born with. This is not through nurture. This is nature. He says clearly, natur, nature. This is Mutvah, betulda mebet, how we're born. The klaluson, and in general, all these emotions you just described, hubchinis chesed v'gvura, are basically forms of chesed, the flow of chesed, of kindness and love, and gvura, restraint or discipline or severity. V'hainu, im toiv oira, if it's a positive or a negative disposition. He says toiv oira, it sounds like good and evil. I don't think he means evil here as an evil person, because that's up to choice. But this is more personality, meaning a good disposition or a negative one. I think that's what he means by ra here. Or ra could also be that certain people's personalities, like he said, achzari, crueler, less sensitive, in that context. But it's important to distinguish that when no one's born teivra, that Rambam says that clearly. There's no such thing as being born good or bad. It's born different dispositions and different characteristics and personality types. So that's general chesed and gvura, ukahai gavna, and the same similar b'chol hamidus, v'hispidus v'nitzuach, and same with all the midas. After chesed and gvura comes to feres. Hispidus means proud, someone being boastful even. But hispidus doesn't necessarily mean a negative. Hispidus means in general somebody that is proud of himself. V'nitzuach. And nitzuach is a determined or a very ambitious or a victorious type of person, wants to always win. A need to dominate or win. Hakol neled b'teva. All this is born into the person, ingrained by nature, in his nature. B'eifem prati, in a very specific way, b'chol echad ve'echad, or b'chol echad ve'achas. Every individual. Ve'ein echad deimel lechavere. So every individual has their particular way they're wired, they're naturally wired. And one, and ve'ein echad, there's no one that's deimel lechavere, that's similar to another. Which makes it even more interesting. In other words, not just some are one category. Even in that, even though in each individual, yeshnam kol hamidus, there are all these emotions, meaning all these characteristics, I should say, emotional characteristics. Nevertheless, one is not similar to the other. Prate his galus hamidus, in the specific way that these midas are revealed. In other words, everybody has chesed, gvura, teferes, netzach, chayid, yesod, malchus. That everybody has. Just like everybody has a nose, eyes, and a mouth and ears. Every healthy person has that, but doesn't mean that they're same features. That's why there are no two faces that are alike. Even though the components of a face are similar, but everyone has a different way, as he says, beprati is galus hamidus, how these emotions are expressed and how the specific way as they are revealed. Shezeu hatiyas hanefesh, that is the inclination of the nefesh, of the soul, of the spirit. Each one has their particular indentation or inclination or direction. I'm sorry, shezeu hatiyas hanefesh v'kol hakeches. This is the inclination of the nefesh and all the faculties. Im bechesed, if it's inclined toward chesed, oy begvura, oy behispirus. In chesed, in kindness, or gvura, restraint, or severity, or hispirus, pride. Hispirus, I don't think he means here compassion, because usually when he says teferes, hispirus could be compassion. Can hispirus be translated as compassion? Rab Shleima? I don't think so. I think hispirus is more pride.
I'm thinking b'derech klal hispirus is exaggerating himself, but here,
like boastfulness.
yeah,
pride.
But here maybe he means just the general.
No, here he doesn't necessarily mean. Say no. He doesn't mean negative. Hispirus could mean just somebody who's has a certain element of
Right.
pride.
Yeah.
I was asking if hispirus can be translated as rachamin. I don't think so, right? Hispirus would not be an expression of rachamin.
Tiferes, because he's saying chesed, gvura,
Yeah. Okay. In Tanya Sof Perek Aleph, there he's talking the Midos Chassidus Haroim.
Right.
So there hispirus is boastfulness and just ego type of thing. Yeah. Okay.
Because there he's talking about hispirus and he's talking about gaiva.
Yeah. Yeah. That Chassidus Haroim. Here is now. Okay, fine. V'akol kefi ha'ashrosha shor sheyesh be'etzem ha'nefesh. And all of this, why is a person wired this way? It's all based on the root, ha'ashrosha shorshis, the rootedness, the embedded rootedness in the core of the soul, as was explained earlier. Hey, 1 second, earlier, where was this explained? Wasn't recent, was it? Anybody remembers this? If it was a while back, I remember it was a while back, but not in volume 3. I don't believe. No. I'll find it. Commission is barely ill. Okay. I think I'm going to stop here because the next section is going to be a longer section. He's going to explain. I'll just read a few lines, but I don't want to go into in depth because it deserves its own. It says, Ach inyan Mutvah. Now this Mutvah that we just spoke about, a person is wired in their very core, rooted.
Please explain also what he said here, the shrosh or shorshi is be'etzem hanefesh. Please explain tomorrow, what does it mean exactly?
Okay, I will. I have to look up where it says it earlier, but upon him, the next 3 lines, he's going to talk about how Mutvah is the Midos that are rooted within us, but they're not yet revealed. In other words, a newborn baby, for example, has all this wiring already in there, but it's not obvious to anyone. Nobody knows about it. I mean, you can guess that the child's going to have some of the personality of its parent, but you don't see any of it. That's what he's going to discuss, how Mutvah is already, there's a Midos are wired in there, but it's not yet revealed. But I'd rather stop here because I don't want to start and then it deserves, learning it more in depth. And I'll also explain the shorshis, the rootedness. I remember it's earlier, but I remember a long time back. It says canal. It sounds like not far back. Okay, let me look it up. So I'm going to stop here, but I want to stop. Anybody wants to ask anything? Oh, it's clear. Okay, so we got to the bottom of page, more or less the bottom, close to the bottom of page 1222. Mutvah, Murgash, Muskal, Ibr Yanika Meichin. And we're going now into the Rebbe Rashab dissecting the human psyche, and especially the emotional psyche of a person. It's very fascinating stuff, this stuff. There's a whole mimer in Tafshin Gimel. I remember when I first learned it, Friedrich Rebbe in Tafshin Gimel, 1943. There's a whole mimer about it. I see it's based a lot on this. Very, gives you very good insight into how we work, our functions, because as adults, our emotions, we're aware of our emotions, but it's hard to distinguish between what's natural, what's nature, what's nurture, what is good, what should be, what can be controlled, what you can't control, what can be restrained, tamed. So understanding how the emotions develop and work gives a tremendous way of self-control to say, okay, let me figure out what's something about me that either I'm wired this way or is it, and how you can so-called mature, and I'd rather say not mature, harness and train your emotions to be far healthier than they are. The key to everything is emotional intelligence and emotional refinement. So this is all going to be part of that process. So it's quite practical in that way. But rest assured, we'll be going back to Lifnei Tzimtzum at some point.